Being sick and all, I figured it would be a good time to go ahead and talk to you all a little bit about European society in 1660. Sorry, my voice doesn't sound the best, but feeling a little bit better, so not really a problem at this end. Missing today, I really don't want us to get too much behind. I thought I was just going to give you all a handout, but I thought, you know what, maybe it would be a little bit better if you at least had some images and charts and things of that nature to connect to what we are talking about. So what I want to do here is just be very general, very broad with you all, and give you all some idea of just kind of ordinary life, if you will, in Europe in 1660. In this class, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about trends in politics and warfare and intellectual life and religion and things of that nature. But I don't want us to forget about the lives of ordinary people. So that's what I'm going to try to do here, is just kind of lay that foundation, and then when we come back on Tuesday, then I'm going to start looking at some broader trends in politics and government and things of that nature, and we'll at least have some idea of what ordinary society was like, against which to put that information that we'll be talking about on Tuesday. So first and foremost, just a little bit about sources and statistics. Obviously, we spent a lot of time talking about sources in this class, and I believe I mentioned that the closer you get to the present, obviously, the more sources there are available. And so, while we do have a lot of different sources from the 17th century, while we do have, for example, tens of thousands of books still in existence from that time period, one thing we don't necessarily have a lot of are things like government documents. Partly that is due to just documents not being stored properly, due to just erosion over time, or disasters, wars, things of that nature. But also, it's due to the fact that governments in the 1600s were just really coming into the idea of keeping good records. Something we'll talk about a little bit more in detail on Tuesday. So either way you look at it, while we do have some decent sources to look through, we don't necessarily have enough to give us a completely accurate image of early modern European society. For example, when you look at things like population, we're still pretty much just trying to get a good guesstimate as to what population numbers were like at the time. So what are we looking at when we're talking about population? Well, generally speaking, historians believe that the population of Europe during the 17th century was probably around 70 to 80 million by the time you get to the end of that century. So much, much smaller than today, where we're talking in the 400s of millions of people living in Europe nowadays. And of course, there's a lot of variation within that number. France is generally understood to have had the largest population at the time. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 17 to 18 million people in France by the end of the 1600s there. Much smaller, of course, than today, where France has about 66, almost 67 million people. England, another country we'll spend a lot of time looking at, a heck of a lot smaller than it would become later on. In the middle of the 17th century, around 1640, 1650 or so, England's population was probably around 5.5 million, and really wasn't growing all that much. As a matter of fact, if you look at this graph here of England's population over time, you really get this idea of how low England's population was compared to where it was ultimately headed. And you if you look down there, around 1500 to 1600, you can see that England does suffer population-wise during what are called the plague centuries. the plague, various other diseases, obviously a common problem in Europe at this time. And that does a lot to keep population numbers pretty low across much of Europe. Um, Europe had actually enjoyed some uh, population increase during the Middle Ages, but as you can see in England's case on this chart, you see that you have the Black Death in the 1340s, and that hits England, that hits France, it hits Italy, Germany, and it really puts not just England but all of Europe on a pretty poor trajectory population-wise for the next few centuries. It takes a while for the continent to really completely recover from that disaster. Um, Here in the 1600s, when we're starting our story of Western civilization, Europe is really struggling population-wise. Um, One thing that's important to really keep in mind when we talk about European society at this time is that families are very much the center of social and economic life. Um, Everything really seemed to revolve around family. That's really the touchstone for most individuals. In a lot of ways, in this period, people identify less as individuals like we might today, and definitely much more identify with the family that they are a part of, and that could be said at a social level as well as at an economic level. In a lot of ways, the household what was really the center of economic activity in Europe here in the 17th century. For example, while you do have manufactured goods at the time, obviously not at the same level as you would have after the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, but there is some manufacturing, but it's manufacturing in a much different kind of context. At this time, we have what's called the putting out system, also known as the cottage industry, in which a lot of work is parceled out to individual households. A good example would be in the weaving industry, where merchants would parcel out the wool, cotton, things of that nature to individual households, and in those individual households, then they would do the work of turning that wool or cotton into cloth. And you can see that in a lot of different industries, not just in the cloth industry. For those families who aren't involved in any kind of manufacturing, if for example it's a family involved in a trade or a craft, oftentimes that the business, if you will, is very much a part of the family home. If you live in a large urban area like London or Naples or Paris, some city like that, odds are, if you're a blacksmith or a baker or a shoemaker or what have you, odds are your home is right there, either at the back of your shop or on the floor above it. So work is very much incorporated into the daily life of the household in a way that it might not be today, where we live in our homes, miles and miles away from our place of work. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single person worked in their home, of course. You do have people who, might not necessarily own a business, but they might be like an apprentice or a journeyman in some craft, and they might have to travel, a little bit of a distance to go to their place of employment. Though, it was actually pretty common for people who might be in that position of being a journeyman or apprentice to maybe, live with, have room and board with the family that owned the business they were working for. All that being said, one thing we should, of course, not forget is that for the vast majority of families in Europe at this time, their lives are not wrapped up in a trade or a craft. They're not necessarily participating in something like the putting out system. Instead, the vast majority of people are farmers, whether they're peasants who don't own their own land, or small landholders. either way, the experience of the majority of European people in the 17th century is a life centered on agriculture. Um, Now that brings us to looking at families, and I just want to have a few images of families painted here in the 17th century. One thing we definitely need to be aware of as we look at these images here is that obviously the families who are able to have portraits painted of them are not necessarily representative of the population at large. Getting your portrait painted either as an individual or as a family was a not only costly endeavor, but it obviously took a lot of time. So generally speaking, the portraits you see are of families who are what we would think of as upper middle class or very upper class families. There are exceptions, of course. You see there in the middle a Dutch portrait of what we might think of as a peasant family gathering around their table to say grace before their meal. So you do have some images of peasant families, but again, they're just not as common. Either way, one thing to think about as far as families are concerned is that not only are they the center of economic life and society, but we must also think about ways in which family in that day and age might not exactly match up with what we would expect families at this time. For example, it's commonly held belief that in centuries past, the age at marriage was much younger than today. The idea of people in the 1600s getting married at 15, 16, 17. In our eyes, that seems like that must have been how it was the case. The truth is, though, is it wasn't exactly like that. Now, that's not to say there aren't exceptions. Obviously, there are always exceptions to every rule. But generally speaking, the only families where you would really see marriage at an early age would typically be your aristocratic families, especially maybe royal families, where there is this idea of marriage primarily to establish alliances. In those kinds of cases, if you are the ruler of England or the ruler of France, and you want to make sure that your children marry well, and want to make sure that you put your nation in a strong position diplomatically, then yes, it might be wise for you in your position to ensure that your son gets married at the age of 15 or something like that. But again, that's not necessarily going to be the case for the vast majority of individuals in Europe at this time. If you look at northwestern Europe in the 1600s, think England, France, the Netherlands, places like that. Generally speaking, the age at marriage for both male and female hovered around the mid-20s. A lot of times it had to do with the structure of families in northwestern Europe. Typically, family size in that day and age was relatively similar to ours today. Typically, a household consisted of the husband and the wife and the kids, and not much in the way of an extended household, which meant that in order to be able to get married, you had to be in a position to be able to provide for the family. And in a lot of cases, especially in the case of males at the time, they wouldn't have really been able to provide for their families until their mid-20s, after they had gone through maybe an apprenticeship learning a craft. Maybe they had labored enough as a farmer and saved some money to be able to purchase a home of their own. Whatever the case, they're not really able to provide, make a living for their family until their mid-20s. Now, again, it's not going to be the case in Southern or Eastern Europe. In Southern and Eastern Europe, where families were typically much larger and where you oftentimes had this idea of the extended household where you had several generations living under one roof, there it's going to be much more common to get married earlier. Typically, males in southern and eastern Europe are getting married in their early 20s, and pretty common for women to be married by the time they were 20. That said, um, that there are such things as single individuals. And depending on what part of Europe you're looking at in the 1600s, it's estimated that something like, for example, 1/6 of females never married. Um, and marriage was something that was oftentimes difficult to enter into, especially for economic reasons. Again, if there is this idea dominant in places like northwestern Europe where in order to be married you have to be able to provide for your family, well, in a day and age where the economy is not as vibrant as it is today, that's going to make it pretty difficult for every individual that wants to get married to get married. Last thing I want to say about families, and then we'll move on to talking about fertility and childbirth for a second. I do want um, to mention here that well, never mind. I don't really need to go down that rabbit hole too much. So why don't we just go ahead and transition to talking a little bit about fertility and childbirth. Again, just to kind of give us a fuller image, if you will, of society at this time. Again, we have a lot of misconceptions about the past, and I'm sure we've all believed at some point in our lives that not only were people getting married at a younger age in the past, but that families were much larger, and that women must have been pregnant all the time. But that's not necessarily the case. Again, bearing in mind that our sources are not as full and complete as they are for, say, the 20th or the 21st century, from what we can best tell, especially in northwestern Europe where record keeping was better and where we have more sources surviving, it does appear that the average woman was probably pregnant about 4 or 5 times during her life. And that's generally in those years, kind of 25 to 45, those years where women would be the most fertile. And so you're not talking about a constant litany of pregnancies, just one after another. It does appear that oftentimes there's about 2.5 years in between pregnancies for most women. Again, primarily looking at northwestern Europe, where we have better records and sources. So again, it's not you get pregnant, give birth, and bang, again pregnant, give birth, just constantly for 10 or 20 years. That's not the case at all. And that's something that is oftentimes kind of made historians wonder, how that's the case. How are they spacing out their pregnancies, especially given knowledge at the time of contraception. It does appear that there are a couple of things that families used to limit their family size at the time. There is always the traditional coitus interruptus that you could use to prevent pregnancy, faulty as that system might be, of course. There were condoms at the time, oftentimes made out of animal innards of some kind, like sheep intestine. Generally speaking, though, condoms weren't going to be as widely available as they would be later on, and oftentimes there's something that could maybe only be afforded by upper classes. Another thing that could be used, again, though obviously not foolproof contraceptive method, is breastfeeding. The act of breastfeeding does act in some ways, it is believed, as not necessarily a contraceptive, but that it does keep the female body from being as fertile as as it would be without breastfeeding. And in this day and age, of course, breastfeeding is going to be the most common way of providing nourishment to infants. Only in very elite families would you see women handing off nursing duties to what might be called a wet nurse. So for most women, breastfeeding is a natural part of their cycle of life, and in its own way, that acted as a limitation on fertility. Here we have a couple of images that I find just somewhat fascinating. We might not necessarily think that there would be portraits of pregnant women in the early modern era, but there we have an image of an unnamed English woman around 1595 or so. It's a little bit before our time that we are looking at. Over there on the other side of the page, you see a couple of images from an English birthing manual from the 1680s or 1690s, I believe. You have the birthing stool that women would typically sit on. Image of the fetus inside the womb there. This is basically a guide for doctors. One note on that real quick, by the way. Generally speaking, across Europe at this time, the act of giving birth is primarily a female experience, in that women only are going to be present in the birthing room. The idea of men being present either in the person of a doctor or of a husband, that's not going to be the case. Now, there is going to be a trend beginning of medical assistance, if you will, being provided by male doctors, but that's only just beginning at this time. Generally speaking, your assistance in the giving of birth is going to be from a midwife, a female midwife. So again, we're just starting to see this idea of male doctors even being allowed in the birthing room. Now, one last thing here. It is important to note that childbirth was a pretty deadly ordeal. Not only could you have complications through, say, breech birth, or complications from maybe the umbilical cord being too tightly around the infant's neck or something of that nature, but childbirth was also pretty risky for women, and it's estimated that about 1 to 2% of women died in childbirth. So it's definitely a time in something that we take for granted today. Just the simple act of giving birth wasn't always something that guaranteed survival. And then, of course, for the infant, yes, maybe you've been successfully delivered, but in many cases, your hardship's just beginning. The mortality rate for infants was incredibly high in this day and age, especially in crowded urban areas where disease was so rampant. I mean, it's estimated, for example, that in London in the late 1600s, that an estimated 1 in 6 infants died before their first year, if not more. So this is a period where the act of giving birth and of being an infant isn't necessarily all that great. And I just mentioned that being in urban areas is pretty risky as far as disease is concerned. And so I want to talk very briefly about cities and mortality here. Here we have an image of London, just to give you an idea of what London looked like in the late 1600s. A nice panoramic view. And one thing that you can probably pick up on this is that cities are pretty crowded at that time. And of course, the overcrowdedness of cities combined with the complete and utter lack of sanitation and poor supplies of safe drinking water, really all of that combined to make cities just really a cesspool of disease and high mortality rates. Again, especially for those who are much younger in age. That being said, as large as cities might be in Europe at the time, they're nowhere near as large as they would get. Here, just found a table that gives you an idea of city size over time in Europe. So if you look there at 1650, you see that Paris is the largest city at 400,000, London at about 350,000. So, as big and crowded as these cities would be at the time, they're still not even half the size of Fort Worth today. But again, they aren't exactly the safest places to live. If you want to be able to avoid the plague or a typhus outbreak or a smallpox outbreak, your odds of survival are going to be much greater in the countryside. And that was something that people were pretty aware of at the time. That cities, on the one hand, could be engines of economic growth. They could be great scenes of entertainment. But, the risks that accompanied it were pretty great. And speaking of mortality here, one thing to keep in mind is that, oftentimes we hear that, life expectancy, in the Middle Ages or even after is pretty low. That if you made it to your 30s or 40s, that's considered an old person. Because you see these numbers of life expectancy at 35 or 40, and you look at those numbers, and of course you're going to think, well, gosh, yeah, if you make it to 35 or 40, you must be considered pretty old. But it doesn't really quite work out like that. One thing to keep in mind is that when you look at these numbers, that's your life expectancy at birth. And so built into that is that high infant mortality rate. So if you made it past your first year, and especially if you made it past your 5th year, then, you have a pretty good shot of making it. Maybe not to your 70s or 80s. That's not rare, but it's not all that common. But you do have a pretty good shot of making it to your 50s and your 60s. So definitely keep that in mind when you see numbers tossed about as far as mortality in this day and age. So that really brings this to a close. I know there's a lot more we probably could have explored, but again, just wanted to give you something of a foundation, a baseline, as we talk about Europe kind of building up from 1660. I hope you all have a great weekend, and I will see you all on Tuesday. Remember, of course, if you have any questions or concerns between now and then, just contact me at the email address listed on my course syllabus. Otherwise, see y'all next week.